I'm not quite that mean. I just use a spray bottle. Okay, now I almost laid it flat. All right, I'm going to set this up here. Well, maybe not. That's going to get splashed. I'll set it here. It's a little green looking, but I think it'll be okay.
You ready now? Oh.
I have a tendency to be really OCD and try to do everything.
I can do that on it depends on here. There's a lot more detail to the sketch. I just started. The most of the interest in this is going to be the rock show. So I was effort. Usually in,
Are you going to leave your skylight?
yeah.
Gorgeous.
I wanted to shift the colors from this kind of blue. Somebody in my paintings wanted to gray, yellow, and red. Oh, yeah.
Nothing. They're both one syllable, but that's enough.
And it looks very fakey if you paint a picture that way. You stop one thing, stop another thing, right at some line. It all looks outlined. Which is not bad if you're doing a wash pen and ink drawing or something like that that's intended to have that effect, that sort of stained glass effect. But if you want a painting that looks more realistic, it's not going to do it for you. So I painted the sky right over the cliff line, and of course the sky isn't darker than the cliff everywhere. And so what I'll do first is I'll go back out areas that I know are going to be lighter, and I'll just lift them out a little bit. Can we see okay here? Okay, in the photograph, pretty much all these areas are lighter than the cliff as when they get away down away from the sky. So I'm going to lift up a lot of the blue out of here. One of the reasons that I chose ultramarine for this was because I knew I was going to want to be lifting. And indent frame blue, fallow blue, they just don't lift very well. They're staining colors, they get in the paper and they stay. But the ultramarine, you can get out pretty easily. As I've mentioned a few times going around the room, watercolor does redissolve in water, and you just need to give it time. One way to avoid a lot of scrubbing is to let the water sit on the paper long enough that it actually dissolves the paint. And then with luck, you don't have to do a lot of scrubbing, you can just actually lift. And there's a lot of people don't really understand that there is a difference between scrubbing and lifting. You know, when you scrub, you're actually removing paper. When you're lifting, with any luck, all you're doing is pulling paint back off the paper. Okay. And also lifting is different than shoving paint around the paper. You can redissolve the paint and then use a brush, but all you're doing is moving it from here to there. And I will guarantee you that there's going to be 5 or 10 people in here, and I I'm not gonna speculate on who. But they're gonna have paintings that at the end look overworked with these very heavy edges. You know, very dark, kind of thick edges, and almost invariably what's caused that is they work too long on painting, and they take a brush and they keep doing this, and they're moving the paint from the center of the wash out to the edge over and over and over. It takes a lot of time to really mess up a picture that way. Thousands of brush strokes, but people really do it. Okay, now, I don't know if you can see this. I sat there gathering and let the water dissolve the paint a little bit. Now, I didn't do any scrubbing at all, but if you look up here, you can see that, see this paler area? I just let some water sit on the paper, and I talked for a while, and then I just blotted it. That way I get the paint off the paper without the paper being roughed up. When you paint on the paper a lot, you do a lot of scrubbing, what happens is little fibers start sticking up like a bad hair day, frizzy hair, you know. And when you do that, then you can't get any more crisp edges in the paper. You've dissolved all the sizing out of the paper, you've roughed up the fibers, and it's like painting on blotter paper, it just kind of spreads. Excuse me if I make funny noises. I'm sucking on a lemon drop so I can continue to talk.
David, so what you're doing is you're lifting the pigment that was painted over the nut range of the rocks.
I'm lifting the sky pigment that I had painted over the rocks in areas where I know the rocks are going to be paler than the sky. And I'm trying to do it with a minimum of scrubbing and abrasion of the paper. That's why I'm just pushing down and lifting things up. And it comes off with kind of a pale blue paper towel. Okay, so you can see this now. I didn't lighten it a lot. I mean, it's a subtle thing, but it makes a big difference in the end. Now I'm going to go ahead and start painting in the rocks. It's going to be a lot different than when I painted the sky and the water, where I wanted it very, very wet and drippy. I wanted it to give a real smooth texture. The rocks are rough, and you don't really necessarily have to paint anything with it. You paint the whole thing dry brush, and I do tend to paint them pretty dry. And the contrast between the painting textures helps differentiate the way the rock looks from the sky and water in the final painting. People who paint dry brush habitually have a very hard time with water like this, because since they use the same brush stroke all the time, everything on the painting has a tendency to look like it has the same texture all the time. And so I'm trying to get you to match the techniques in your painting to the texture of whatever you're painting. Does that make sense so far?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, the rocks are basically the basic background color is raw sienna and black sienna. I'm using a flat half-inch brush, fairly dry. And it's going to have a lot of sort of different colors to it. Little variation in color makes the rock look more interesting. I'm using a little bit of Windsor yellow there, which is sort of like cadmium yellow. In this area that's going to be the center of interest of the painting, if I depart from the palette and have another planetary system intruding, I usually want to do it right in the area where I want people to look. You know, you take some bright color that's a little bit out of tune with the rest of the picture, and you put it at your center of interest, and it's look at me, you know, look here. And one of the reasons that you like to pick out a center of interest if you can, and emphasize it by using compositional things like the clouds and waves, or brighter colors, or more contrast, more detail, so forth and so on. One of the reasons that you do that, aside from just making the painting look interesting, is that it allows you to put most of your detail in that area and think very carefully, because you know that's where people are going to be looking most of the time. Then you can kind of slough it off when you get to the outer areas of the picture away from that. And people's first impression is that you spend a lot more time painting details in this picture than you actually did. What you actually did was you painted the details where you knew that they were going to look because you tricked them into looking at it. It's fair. You know, people buy a painting, to a certain extent, it's like buying a ticket to a magic show or something. You know you're going to be fooled, but you know, you pay for the fun of seeing how the guy did it if you can. I think I'm going to use a bigger brush because it's a bigger rock, and I don't want to sit here all day. Okay, now I've got a lot of frosting, and as I said, if you look around at the rocks out here, you'll see that there's just a lot of frosting in them. It's kind of an unavoidable color.
Is that burnt sienna now?
Burnt sienna.
Burnt, yeah.
I blame it on old age, but I remembered what it was yesterday. Nothing like being fired up when you're trying to do a brush around.
You're covering up the white, so when you put your hand up like that?
What I'm doing is masking off the bottom part of the picture, so I kind of have a chance to look at the area I'm working on by itself. If you spend much time in any kind of critique group or anything like that, you'll see, you know, people are always doing this kind of thing. First time Priscilla saw it, she said, "What's this syntax code?" You know, they're all kids. Some are four signals. Yeah, that was years and years ago, but, you know, now she knows. We're not sending dirty messages to each other and insulting each other. But you do that basically so you can see where the problems and where the good areas are. If you take a painting and the painting sort of doesn't look quite right, and you stick up your hand and all of a sudden it looks a lot better, you know that what your hand is covering kind of looks pretty bad. And then you got to figure out why. Reminds me a little bit of you meet all sorts of people out on the lake. And we were out one time, just just before we left the marina in our houseboat one night, or the buoy field, I think it was. And we had everything packed up and we were getting ready to go out the next morning. And somehow, Priscilla will probably remember how we met these people. There were some people in a rental boat. And I think it was the night we met. Well, we got talking to them and we went over, they came over our boat and we went over their boat. And, they were having, they had a themed drink of the night trip. Which was kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And I believe that night was margarita night. Now, we had a real good time. And this fellow worked for the railroad. BNSF, I think, if I remember right. And he gave me, which I still have to this day, it's a trainman's lantern. It's like one of these battery lanterns, got a handle on it, and a funny sort of a framework at the end of it, and it's got two bulbs. One is like a regular flashlight, and then the other is just a bare bulb. So that I guess from a distance, one looks a lot brighter and one looks dimmer. And after a few margaritas, the fellow got up and he was explaining to us the code they used with these lanterns, different. And I hadn't realized that they had a whole informal code, some of which you couldn't repeat. And, and he showed us code for all sorts of things that I didn't know trained people called each other, but it was a lot of fun.
What colors are you using?
This is ultramarine blue and raw sienna and a little bit of the quinacridone magenta. And this is the area that's further back. This area here. And it sort of recedes in the background in the photograph. I'm going to try to make it recede even more in the painting because I don't want to spend a lot of time. There's a lot of detail back there. And you may want to fake putting in that detail, but I don't want to actually paint it in. So I'm going to try to come up with a fairly neutral kind of purplish color.
David, we're kind of getting a good view of the back of your neck right now. Yeah.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you for letting me know, because as I said, I have no way of...
Well, that's
No.
perfect now. Perfect.
Now, I am painting this, you'll notice, I'm painting this wet on wet. And the reason is I'm not putting any details or texture in here right now, number one. And number two, because I'm playing with the color and the tone of it. And when you have a wet on wet wash, you can adjust the color and the value as you're putting the wash on. And so I'm putting in this very wet wash because I can change the borders of it, change the shape of it, as long as it only keeps getting bigger. And I can change the colors. The one thing I need to watch out for, and what happened to a lot of people when you were doing your wet washes, you might be able to see it's developing a dark edge up here. And that's because as I put more paint and water in the middle, it pushes the pigment out to the edge of that wash. So what I've got to do is one of two things. I can get what they call a thirsty brush and suck up a little of that paint. And then I can always take some clear water if I want and drop it in right inside that edge and let it push some paint out. That gives me a very sharp edge here though. I'll be talking about these edges on washes because there's a lot of subtle things going on. And it's almost impossible to demonstrate everything that can happen inside of an hour. So I'll probably be repeating myself a lot. Another thing that you can do is you can just make it a little bigger. Okay, I'm going over this previous edge where I thought, oh, that's getting dark and ugly. And I just make it about a millimeter past or 1/16 of an inch past where it was. And then I run the paint back inside the wash. You do need to remember when you do this, and it's going to happen a lot on some paintings that are difficult paintings especially, is that the dark area gets bigger every time you try to tweak an edge that way. And for instance, in the cliff reflections down in the water here, there's going to be some people who have made correction, and all of a sudden they find the entire water is now cliff reflection and it's all dark. But we'll be revisiting that this afternoon probably. Now, I've got a little bit, I've got a color differential between here and here. This, since I had painted raw sienna underneath, and it looks a little more, burnt sienna, excuse me, it looks a little browner here, a little more purple there. I'm going to fix that by dropping in a little burnt sienna up there, even it out. Just in a few places. As I said, the one thing that you really need to watch out for is pushing paint to the outside of a wash. I tend to get in the habit, if I'm diddling in one of these washes here, of taking the brush and starting at the outside and shoving things in. I can get away with a lot more that way. The other thing is that if you have a big wet wash like this, and this isn't really big, we're really wet, but you need to look at what that wash is depicting on the painting, what it's supposed to be. In this case, it's a bunch of distant, mostly vertical cliffs. And so I'm using brush strokes that would be in a vertical direction on the cliff, so that if I mess up the texture or something, I get a little bloom or whatever, it's going to be in a direction that's natural for that subject. And if I had done it in the sky, I'd try to follow what I thought would be a nice cloud line or something with all my brush strokes.